Okay, so let's begin part three of the story of an hour. And now, like I mentioned, we are going to talk about the story itself. So, keeping the setting notes and the irony notes in mind, let's look at a couple of things. The story starts on page 95 in the stories volume of our text. And I want you to notice that in both the first short story, Young Goodman Brown, and the story of an hour, what is happening with the introduction? So the introductory paragraph here is as follows. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So in both Young Goodman Brown and the story of an hour, we see authors using something called in media res. That is E-N, the word media, M-E-D-I-A, res, R-E-S. So this means in the middle. So the stories begin in the middle. The conflict is already there when the story begins. Young Goodman Brown has already made the decision to walk into the forest. Brentley Mallard is already thought to be dead, and they're trying to figure out a way to tell Louise without doing her any injury. So this is a technique in which the introduction, if you remember kind of those, what they're called Freyer diagrams, the plot structure of a story, and we'll be going over that within the next story or two more specifically. They draw it as if each part of the story takes the same amount of time. The introduction is equal to the rising action, which is equal to the falling action, and the resolution. And in short stories, that's just not true. Those plot diagrams are based on classic pieces. Greek plays, Shakespearean plays follow that very precisely. When you have short stories, they have a limited amount of time and space in order to get you into the action and to get to some sort of resolution. So they focus much less on that introductory portion and much more on the rising action, on the building of that conflict. So that's what we're seeing in these two short stories, that the authors are using this technique in media res to just open in the beginning with the conflict already there, and the reader has to catch up a little bit. So what happened to Brentley Mallard, and they're going to get to that using a lot less wording than they would if this were a novel or even a play. All right, so we know that this is taking place in her home in the front hall. She is greeted with this news, and then the setting changes and we go into Louise's room with her. So I want you to notice that it says, she did not hear the story, as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden, wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. So there are only really two locations, in Louise's room and outside Louise's room. So outside Louise's room, in the front hall or wherever she is in the house, she's always encountering bad news there. She's dealing with grief while she is in these two places. And the atmosphere, the environment shifts greatly when Louise is alone and she's in her room. Now, it takes a little bit of time for that shift to occur, but it is a dramatic difference at the end when she leaves and goes again downstairs in her home. All right, so the physical location, the imagery has a lot to do with making the environment of this physical location evident. She sits down. This is important imagery, and I'm on page 96 here. There stood facing the open window a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see in the opening square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The note of a distant song, which someone was singing, reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. So what we see here is a woman who has come from a dark, oppressed location to sit before a window in which life is beginning again. The rain has ended. There's fresh spring air out there. The birds are beginning to sing. The sun is starting to shine. People are coming back out into the street, and life is happening. Now notice that this happens, one, after she physically calms down a little bit and she can begin to notice it. And two, there is still a separation between her and this new life that she's witnessing. She's not out in the street. She's not even in her garden or her front yard. She is still in her home on the other side of the window. Now the window is open so she can start to see what this life would be like, what this new life is, but she isn't there yet. She's not joining in at this point, and that's important. All right, so at this point, I want to talk about the temporal setting. Now, this is a story that is not on the list of stories that you can write about, so I am going to talk a little bit more about the temporal setting, more than I would in a story that you would be writing about for a new critical essay, because remember I said that you don't really talk about anything in the context of the story with a new critical essay. You only talk about the author's words. But what I'm about to tell you is important for the context of the story. It adds a layer of understanding to interpretation. So 1894 is on the heels of what we would call the Victorian era. And the Victorian era was an English time period named after Queen Victoria, and it covered her reign as queen. So in British literature, there's a whole Victorian literature genre and time period that doesn't really happen in America. We go mostly from Romanticism into realism, whereas in Victorian England, they carried that Romanticism a little bit into Victorianism. In England, they were dealing with what they called the woman problem. And this happened early in Queen Victoria's reign, that the country is kind of in a quandary about how to deal with things like a woman in power, and how to deal with the fact that there were women in society who were beginning to campaign and argue for extending their rights. At this point in time, they couldn't own property. They didn't have control over their own money. They could not vote, could not be involved in politics. So they were starting to say, hey, the monarchy is a woman. She's ruling on her own. Her husband has the title of Prince Consort. He's not the king. So she is the ruler of this incredible empire. It's during the time in which the British, in which that phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, was literally true, because they owned so much land around the world. They had conquered so much. So people, members of parliament, men, were literally calling this the woman problem. So do we give in and give women these rights? What does that mean for us politically? What does that mean for your average man in the house who is used to having a certain amount of control? And it's another term during this time period became popular as kind of an answer to the woman problem. Kind of, not really. And women began to be identified, not identifying themselves, but be identified as a domestic goddess. So this was a term meant to kind of placate women and to explain the significance of their role in society, despite the fact that they could not vote, could not own property, and things of that nature. So the domestic goddess, if we think about these two words individually first, and then put them together and see how that changes each of those words. So one, domestic can mean a couple of things. It can mean not foreign, right? It can mean as having to do with the household. So things like laundry and cooking and dusting and cleaning, things like that. It could also be thought of as like when you domesticate an animal, when we domesticated cats and dogs, what we were talking about is taking something that's wild, that's feral, and making it tame and appropriate for the household to be indoors, to be ruled by their owners. So those are a couple of definitions of domestic. And then you have the word goddess, which on the surface seems like a wonderful thing, right? What woman doesn't want to be thought of as a goddess? A goddess is somebody who is powerful, who is beautiful, who has control and her own agency. But when you take that word goddess and you add the word domestic in front of it, what are you doing to that word? You're basically taking this goddess figure, this powerful figure, and you're putting it in the box of a household. You're taming this deity and exercising control over it. So on one hand, men were saying that women as a domestic goddess were incredibly important to society, that if the home doesn't run well, then society doesn't run well. And that's something that we still believe and buy into, that society can only be as good and strong as individual homes are, right? So we have a problem with crime, with overcrowded prisons, because there's something essentially wrong with our families. As the family breaks down, society breaks down. So they were saying, hey, you have an incredibly important role. If you keep the household together, that means that the monarchy, the whole country, runs much more smoothly. See how important you are? But on the other hand, they're saying, but you're really only important in this one setting, in the house. Outside of the household, you don't really have a role to play. Outside of the household is for men. So as Americans, we weren't as impacted as the British were with this idea, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't fairly prevalent here too. So that's why it's important that we don't see Louise Mallard ever getting out of her house. That she is confined to her house from beginning and end, that she never gets outside of that window and experience life for herself out from under the shelter of her husband. So that adds a little twist of irony there and a little bit of sadness to Louise's situation. So with all of that context, let's go back to that portion of the story and talk about how she's dealing with this grief. So one of the things I want to talk about is the fact that a lot of students, a lot of people read this as Brentley Mallard somehow being a horrible, perhaps abusive husband, that Louise and Brentley don't really love each other, didn't have a good marriage. And I would say that that's not true, or at the very least up for debate. Excuse me. Sorry, it's hard to talk for an hour straight. So there are a couple of things here that tell you that Louise is feeling differently than your average person would expect from a woman who was happily married and getting this news that her husband died. And one of those occurs at the top of page 97. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss this suggestion as trivial. So let's talk about that term, monstrous joy. That's an oxymoron. And an oxymoron is words side by side that immediately contradict each other. So icy hot, jumbo shrimp are kind of the classic examples that we use. A monstrous joy, she's using this term, Chopin is, to describe the fact that it seems like the characteristic of a horrible person to be happy this soon after her husband has died. And not just happy, but joyful. She is being held by a monstrous joy. So it's monstrous because her husband just died, and the joy she's feeling, she can only feel because her husband has died, and yet she feels it. So she doesn't even stop to ask herself, am I a horrible person for feeling this way? She was able to look past the moment to the rest of her life, realizing that this grief is of a moment, and I'll have years and years and years to feel this joy. All right, so that is one of those things that kind of indicates she was not happy in her marriage. But then we get down to the very next paragraph, and it's 2 or 3 paragraphs that kind of explain her marriage and why she feels now as she feels. So I'm going to read those, and we're still on 97. She knew she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. But she saw beyond that bitter moment to a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely, and she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. All right, so let's stop to acknowledge the fact that she has cried over Brentley, and she knows that she will cry again. She does feel sad about the death of this person. And I'm going to skip down to 2 paragraphs down. And yet she had loved him sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? So it says here that she did love him. Did she always love him? No. Often she had not, but none of this indicates that Brentley Mallard himself was a bad person. In fact, it says he had never looked on her save with love. So that indicates that he's not this monster. He's not a horrible, abusive husband. It just wasn't a marriage based in love. And that would have been the reality of the situation for a middle-class woman like Louise Mallard. So let's go back to this domestic goddess idea, the lack of independence that women had, and just acknowledge that Louise has 3 potential paths in her life. The first potential path is to not get married, to stay in her father's home. Now, a little less at this point in time, and maybe a little less in America, but single women who lived with their fathers were often thought of by family members, and they often thought of themselves as a burden because they weren't really contributing anything to the family. They just sort of existed. And Louise could have stayed at her father's house, presumably, but she would have always been a child in that situation. Think of those of you who have now gone off to college and then come home. How kind of grating it is to be back in your parents' house. You're not an adult yet with your own home and spouse and kids at that point in your life. Well, some of you are. But when you leave home and come back and your parents are still thinking of you as a child, as their child, and you've been at college where you don't have a curfew, you can skip a meal if you want, you can eat junk for dinner if you want, and suddenly you go home and there are rules again, rules that you have to follow because you're in their household. And it can be kind of grating. Well, Louise would have faced that situation of being a child forever. It did not matter if she was 30 or 40, if her parents were still living. She was their child. She was living in their household. She would have followed their rules. So that's slightly unpleasant. The only way she could have advanced her standing in the household at that point, if she had stayed with her father, is to kind of take her mother's place as the head of the household if her mother passed away. And even then, that's not great. She's still answering to her father. She still has very little control over what's going on. So her second option would be to get married. Now, Brentley Mallard ostensibly proposed to her, or perhaps her father had some hand in the arrangement. We don't know. But Louise has the right to say no. But if she says no, she's gambling that somebody better is going to come along and she's going to want to marry that guy more. That may or may not happen. We don't really know how old Louise is. Maybe she thought, well, this is as good as it gets. He's a nice guy. I do like him. And that too would have been a gamble. What kind of marriage is this going to be if I'm not head over heels in love with a guy, if we didn't decide together that we want to get married because we love each other? So that would have been the second path. But now Louise is confronted with the third option, which she really has no control over. That is living much of her life as a widow. In many ways, Louise herself and people, women especially in society, would have looked at this as being in many ways a lucky situation. She didn't have to wait until she was 60 years old to be a widow. It says that she is still young here, that she is young with a fair, calm face. So we don't know how long she was married to Brentley, but we do know that she's still young and she's now a widow. And widows have a different status in society. They are really the freest women in society. They've left their father's household. They're not young and naive and innocent anymore. They've had some experience. So they're looked at as women who can have a little control over their lives, exert a little control over their futures. She can now decide if she wants to get married again or not. If she does get married again, it can be because she loves somebody. It doesn't have to be because she's worried about what will happen to her in the future. So that's all the background of what we're seeing in this situation. And Louise did not plan to be a widow. It has happened to her. And she's starting to realize in this very short story, the story of just an hour's length, of what is happening, that she now has this control. She is free, free, free. And she has something that she calls self-assertion, meaning she can speak for herself. She can control what happens in her life. And there's no mother, father, or husband who is going to control that for her. Now, she does acknowledge that people often do that with love, that Brentley Mallard controlled her with love. Your parents, hopefully, control you with love, but it's still control. And there comes a point in your life where you want to control your own things. You want to control your own decisions. And Louise has kind of lucked into that position because Brentley has died. All right, so I want you to notice on 97, we're leaving her room and going back downstairs to the rest of the house. Free body and soul, she kept whispering. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For God's sake, open the door. So this is an example of somebody asserting themselves, of somebody saying, this is what you need to do. And this is what Louise has probably dealt with all her life, especially with a heart condition. She's agreed to do what other people have said she was supposed to do. And probably for the first time in her life, she's not having it. She says, go away. I am not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in the very elixir of life through that open window. Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her, spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday that she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. So she's becoming, just within this short space of time, a different woman, that she has said no to her sister, even though her sister is telling her to do something out of love. She rose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. So we have this term goddess of victory used. And that is certainly different from domestic goddess. So Kate Chopin takes this idea and flips it on its head. She is no longer a domestic goddess. She is a goddess of victory, a goddess that is powerful in her own right, not powerful just within her own house. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. So she comes down a different woman than when she went upstairs. Someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Brentley Mallard who entered, a little travel stain, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of accident, and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. But Richard's was too late. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills. So here we had the most ironic twist of all, that Louise never gets outside of her house, that freedom that she thought she had was sustaining her life after that shock of her husband's death. And it is the taking away of that freedom, that tragedy that kills her, not the fact that her husband is still alive. So that is that situational and dramatic irony. We also had the irony that the doctors believe that she died of joy when we know that she is heartbroken because that freedom that she thought she had, that freedom that changed her in the space of an hour, has now been jerked away from her. And the disappointment is just too much for her to take. So there are lots of little examples of irony there, but that covers the important ones, and that situational and temporal and atmospheric setting are certainly very, very important to the story. Chopin packs a lot into a story that is so short. She's kind of famous for that, short stories that had that ironic twist at the end that really get you. All right, so this was the end of part 3. I hope this recording, I hope this recording is better. Have a great day.